Olá, vou publicar aqui no Direito Sem Juridiquês agora, logo em seguida, depois dessa apresentação aqui, a conversa que eu tive com a professora Melissa Moschella, que foi originalmente publicada no canal Classical Conversations Brasil, no canal do Classical Conversations Brasil, ontem, no dia 27 de setembro, mas achamos por bem, eu e o pessoal da Classical Press, publicar aqui também no Direito Sem Juridiquês para alcançar mais pessoas, para que mais pessoas sejam alcançadas pela abordagem tão relevante e tão significativa da professora Melissa a respeito dos direitos educacionais dos pais. Lembrando que este vídeo foi o primeiro vídeo da semana de lives de lançamento do livro Educação Domiciliar, um Direito Humano Negativo. O trabalho da professora Melissa, um artigo da professora Melissa, foi traduzido para o português por mim e constou como o primeiro capítulo deste livro. E essa semana de lives está acontecendo. Hoje eu acabei de conversar com o professor Vitor Salles Pinheiro, lá no canal do Classical Conversations Brasil, e eu vou deixar o link para esse vídeo e para os demais vídeos também na descrição deste vídeo aqui. Eventualmente eles vêm aqui para o Direito Sem Juridiquês, é importante dar a máxima repercussão, a conversa com o professor Vitor também foi excelente, é importante dar a máxima reprodução aí para esse conteúdo, mas se você quiser acompanhar ao vivo, a não ser que a gente consiga fazer algum ajuste aí para fazer uma transmissão simultânea. Se você quiser acompanhar ao vivo, acompanhe pelo canal do YouTube do Classical Conversations Brasil, tá bem? Então é isso, eu vou já deixar você com essa conversa, fique aí com a professora Melissa Moschella, acompanhe os argumentos dela, que são muito enriquecedores, são muito esclarecedores a respeito dos direitos educacionais dos pais, o que nos permite compreender a educação domiciliar como um direito natural e também como um direito humano, e como um direito natural e humano negativo, um direito que não pode ser impedido pela comunidade política, certo? Essa é a grande ênfase de todo esse trabalho, desse livro que está sendo lançado. O link para a página de venda do livro também está na descrição aqui do vídeo, e você tem até o dia 30 de setembro uma promoção especial de lançamento, tá bom? Então é importante também dar repercussão a isso aqui, caso você tenha interesse em conhecer um pouco mais desse trabalho de defesa dos direitos educacionais dos pais e, em especial, de defesa da educação domiciliar. Então, eu vou deixar você com a professora Melissa Moschella e os direitos educacionais dos pais. Um grande abraço e até a próxima. Well, first of all, Professor Melissa, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'm grateful for the partnership with your article as a chapter of the incoming book. And I'm grateful for this interview, which will be subtitled and will be the first video of our launching week here in Brazil. The video will be published September 27th to record here. Well, that being said, I'd like to ask you to present yourself and also to talk a little bit about how you came to research and write about parental rights in education. I have to say that your work laid the foundation for my presentation of homeschooling as a natural and a human right thesis. I'm hoping that can cause a great impact here in Brazil.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be also a part of your work and to see, my own work taken up for the cause of parental rights in Brazil. My own interest in the topic started back when I was a graduate student, and I read a book, which is one of the books that I engaged with in my own work, by a professor at Princeton named Stephen Macedo, and his book is called Diversity and Distrust, and he argues from the perspective of John Rawls, a kind of liberal Rawlsian perspective, that at least in principle, the state can override the rights of parents when the state deems that that's necessary in order to educate children to be good, respectful, tolerant citizens, which means for him, accepting the Rawlsian idea that one ought not to propose anything in public life on the basis of a comprehensive religious or philosophical view, and that one ought to accept that given the reasonable burdens of judgment, that other people may be sort of equally right as you are about fundamental moral and religious matters, and so on and so forth. And the means to do this is to expose all children to a curriculum that ensures that they have a kind of sympathetic understanding of various worldviews, and also a kind of critical understanding of the worldview that their parents are passing along to them. Now, obviously, the concern of education for citizenship is an important one, but I think the arguments are faulty in part because they fail to recognize that children need to learn a coherent worldview first before they encounter critiques of what their parents are teaching them, or competing conceptions of a good life or of morality. And so, teaching children this in elementary school, even early in high school, as authors like Stephen Macedo suggest, could be very unsettling and confusing for children, could undermine the moral values that parents are trying to pass along, could actually lead to a kind of failure to develop moral maturity at all, which would be in the long run harmful for democracy, right? We need, even the founders of the United States recognize that to have a democracy, you need a virtuous citizenry. You need people who have self-discipline, self-control, and those values are threatened when children are taught, too early to be criticizing the morality that their parents are trying to teach them at home. So that's one among other of the concerns that I had with that. The more foundational one is that it simply presumes that somehow parents and the state are at the same level when it comes to the child's education, that they have a kind of shared authority. And really, when push comes to shove, it's the political community that trumps the parents. So if the political community disagrees about how a child should be educated, either on the basis of concerns about the child's own well-being, or on the basis of concerns about what they take to be required for future democratic citizenship, then the views of the political community will trump the views of parents, who might be very reasonably concerned that what the state wants to teach their children could be confusing or harmful, or undermine the religious or moral values that they're trying to teach them at home. So I realized the need for a way to respond to the kinds of arguments that Dr. Macedo and others have put forth, including many very prominent legal scholars. And so that was kind of the genesis of my own work on the topic.
And so that was during graduation. And I think that we can talk about your doctorship dissertation, your PhD dissertation in Princeton under the advisory of Robert George. How that came to be?
Well, so basically what I just said was ultimately the genesis of the doctoral dissertation. As I was trying to figure out the right topic, I recalled that I had read this book and had found the arguments troubling, and had seen the need for a better response to those arguments than what was out there in the current literature. So there was a lot of literature out there explaining on, say, pragmatic grounds, why generally parents should have the kind of primary right to direct the education of their children, why in general you would expect that parents know better than the state what's in the children's best interests, why perhaps school choice initiatives might be helpful in terms of increasing competition that would improve school quality for all schools, and so on. Many of those arguments had already been made, and some arguments on a more foundational basis had been attempted to kind of explain, well, okay, according to the United States Constitution or the English common law, parents are considered to be primary educators of their children, to have a prior right to direct the education and upbringing of their children. That's also in international law, right, in the UN Declaration on Human Rights and other conventions. But there's a deeper question of, well, why should that be the case? I mean, perhaps sometimes laws get things wrong, and so I didn't find a satisfactory answer as answering the question why. Why should we privilege the educational views of parents for their children instead of saying that their educational rights are shared with the state, for instance, on an equal basis, or that they maybe only have a certain limited degree of educational rights, but that the state can come in and trump those rights whenever it has a serious disagreement. Why isn't that the correct approach? Or why even, shouldn't we go to a model like the Israeli kibbutz or Plato's Republic, where we have basically a kind of communal raising of children? Why haven't most societies done that? Is that just a feature of tradition without a clear reason behind it? Or is there indeed a good reason for saying that generally parents, and in the kind of central case, biological parents, right, who actually conceive and give birth to the child, presumptively are the ones who have the right to direct that child's upbringing and education, instead of thinking that this is a fundamentally communal enterprise. So that was a question that really hadn't been answered in a satisfactory way, in my opinion, and that's what I really tried to delve into in the dissertation and then later in my published work.
So you grounded the analysis in natural law theory. That's right. And so now let's talk about let's talk a little about how you see parental authority in regards to education matters in light of natural law theory, and how that impacts education policy, especially in view of homeschooling, which is the question we are trying to address, especially here in Brazil.
Right. So I think the most fundamental reason why parents have a prior right to direct the education and upbringing of their children, even in cases where the state may disagree about the parents' educational choices, except in cases of genuine abuse or neglect, obviously, but within the range of reasonable, right, non-abusive, non-neglectful choices that loving and responsible, conscientious parents might make about how to raise and educate their children. My argument is that the authority that parents have to make decisions on behalf of their children, including, of course, decisions about education, is authority that arises by nature, as a result of the very nature of the relationship that they have with their children, which means that that authority is prior to the state, prior to political authority, right? Even if there were no government, even if there were no laws, parents by nature would still have the obligation and the authority and the right to direct the upbringing and the education of their children, simply by virtue of being the child's parents. And that's a basic right that has been recognized really throughout the Western philosophical tradition, and more broadly even in other philosophical traditions as well. And I think the reason for that prior authority of parents, which is pre-political in the sense of not necessarily existing prior in time, it's not clear that there ever was a time when we lacked some form of political community, however rudimentary, but prior in the sense that the obligations and the corresponding authority of parents toward their children are in no way derived from the authority of the state. And in fact, the role of the state in this regard ought to be considered as one of helping parents to fulfill their educational task, not of kind of usurping parents or overriding what the parents are doing, but of facilitating the parents' educational task, perhaps by providing resources that the parents might not have, and so on, but not by coercively intervening in ways that undermine the parents' educational authority. And the reason why I think this parent-child relationship by nature, it gives rise to these obligations, is related to the unique tie that parents have to their children. I mean, there's no other relationship that's quite like the parent-child relationship. It's a relationship in which literally, right, it's the relationship that partially causes the child to exist. Right, in the absence of that relationship, the child wouldn't exist. And if the child had different parents, well, he simply wouldn't be the same child, right? You know, who your parents are literally defines your identity as a human being, at least in certain respects, right? What specific organism you are, what sort of DNA that you have, all of these, you know, traits that are related to that, the sort of metaphysical grounding of your identity over time is related to, it's determined by who your parents are, right? So it's an extremely unique relationship, an extremely intimate relationship, and one in which the child is extremely dependent on the parents who brought him or her into being, right? Children are needy and vulnerable in the extreme. And while certainly many of a child's needs could be met by people other than the child's parents, and we know, of course, of many wonderful, generous adoptive parents who take in children whose own biological parents are unable or unwilling to raise them. But nonetheless, in the ideal case, what's best for children, all other things being equal, is to have that initial relationship that began when they were conceived, right, by their biological parents, to have that continue and develop as they grow and mature. The relationship begins as a biological one, right, of the parents creating the child's biological life, but then ideally would continue onto the psychological and moral and spiritual levels as the child matures. And we see even empirically that when there's a break there, right, when the biological parents are not the same as the social parents actually raising the child, in some circumstances that might be the best thing that's possible, right, given the circumstances. But nonetheless, that there's an objective loss there, and that children do suffer from that. They suffer from greater difficulties in coming to an understanding of their identity, because they're not able to get that understanding of identity that naturally comes from being raised by your biological parents and having a sense of your biological origins and ancestry. And they very often have to face very difficult questions about, was I rejected by my biological parents? Did they not care about me? Did they not love me? Why is it that they are not raising me? Those are questions that adopted children, and now with reproductive technologies, children conceived with the egg or sperm of a third party, that they very often face these questions and suffer as a result of these questions. And even research on open adoption indicates that it can be very healing for children when they can ultimately perhaps come to know that their biological parents didn't abandon them, didn't fail to love them, but in fact made a sacrifice to say, well, we would have loved to raise you, but we wanted to give you a better life. And so we sacrificed the ability to raise you so that we could allow you to have a better life with parents who were in a situation that were better equipped to give you all the resources to thrive, right? And that can be very healing, because they realize that there wasn't this abandonment. But what this shows is that there is a very important need that biological parents and only biological parents can meet for their children, which is the need for their own love, right? Yet love is not a replaceable thing. If my husband fails to be kind to me, it doesn't matter how many other people fail to be kind to me, because it's my husband. It matters that he has to be kind to me, right? And show appropriate love for me based on the relationship. Well, the same with children. They may be very well loved by people other than their biological parents, and that's wonderful. But if they have the sense that their biological parents don't love them, there's a hole and a wound there, because they do have a relationship, a unique personal relationship with those biological parents, even if they've never met them. And they have a right to their love, in a sense, right? Love not understood as a feeling, right? But just as a high priority commitment to the well-being of another. And the only circumstances in which biological parents can fulfill their obligation to love their children as they ought without raising them is a situation where there are very strong child-centered reasons for not raising the children, right? So that once the children grow up, if they come to understand, why the biological parents didn't raise them, they can see, oh, that wasn't a reflection of lack of love, but in fact, on the contrary, it was a reflection of their love, right? And then this helps us to see why the biological parent-child relationship matters and why it creates special and personal obligations of the biological parents to the child to raise that child and educate that child. And so it shows why the parents are the ones with the strongest and most direct responsibility for the well-being of the child, and therefore the ones with the greatest authority to make decisions on behalf of the child, since of course looking out for the well-being of children requires making decisions on their behalf, since they're not mature enough to do that. So that's the kind of deeper account of why biological parents are generally expected to raise their own children, why they're presumed to have the right to raise their own children unless it's obvious that they are unfit in some serious way. And so why they have a natural authority, right, to direct the upbringing and education of their children. Now, in relation to homeschooling, right, it's obvious that if parents are the ones with the primary authority to direct their children's education and upbringing, then in cases when they believe that the best way to educate a child is to educate that child directly themselves at home, as long as they are indeed providing a decent education, then there should be no objection to that at all, that parents are simply fulfilling their responsibility and doing it in a conscientious way and trying to meet the specific needs of their child. Homeschooling might not be the best for every child, but parents are the ones who are in the best position to know what a particular child needs and what will most help that child thrive. So if parents see, well, the schools that I can afford that are available to me are schools where perhaps I don't believe that the curriculum is sufficiently rigorous, or I have a concern about the moral environment of the school or about safety in the school. There could be many reasons. Then the parents might decide, well, the best thing to do is to homeschool my child. And again, unless there's some indication that parents are simply failing to provide their children with an education, then there ought to be no objection to that.
In your work, you use the Thomas Aquinas metaphor of the spiritual womb.
Yes.
I think that it's very evocative and elucidative. So perhaps we can talk about a little bit of this metaphor and using it to see that the rights that the parents have is grounded in the obligations that they have,
right.
And that the gestation, I say that in English.
Yes, that's right.
The gestation goes very after this 9 months right. in the physical womb. What do you have to say about that?
Yes. Thank you for reminding me about that. That's one of my favorite kind of metaphors from Thomas Aquinas. So he describes the family as a spiritual womb, which is a kind of continuation of the physical womb, in which the child develops in the first 9 months of life prior to birth. And he says, well, it's just as natural for the child to be gestated in the physical womb of his or her own biological mother, as it is for the child to then be raised to full human maturity within the spiritual womb of the family. And I think that's just a beautiful metaphor that captures the naturalness of the obligations and the authority that parents have, right? It's literally just as natural as a woman bearing her own child in her womb, right? And it also evokes a sense that the family is a kind of sphere, and that within that sphere, parents have sovereignty, right, a kind of authority to make decisions about what happens within that sphere, including crucially, right, the decisions about the education and the upbringing of children. And I think this also helps us to understand why those who want to put the educational authority of parents and the state on the same plane are mistaken, because they're failing to understand that while it's true that children are also members of the larger political community, until they reach adulthood, that membership in the larger political community is really indirect. It's mediated through membership in their more immediate community of the family, just as, for instance, my relationship to a supranational body like the United Nations is indirect, right? The United Nations has no direct authority over me. It would only have authority over me through the mediation of my own United States government, right? So only insofar as my government adopts certain laws and policies on the basis of UN recommendations would I then be affected by the UN. But the UN would almost never kind of come directly in and do something coercively to me. Well, the same thing I think holds analogously with children and the broader political community, that only in very extreme cases would the broader political community be justified in breaking into that spiritual womb of the family and the sphere of authority that it represents. And those cases, I think, are very analogous to the cases that would justify international intervention into the affairs of a sovereign state, right? So there are obviously debates about this, but generally, right, it's considered that other nations or the international community can be justified in intervening into the affairs of another nation only if that nation is seriously threatening the international order in some respect, you know, perhaps building a nuclear arsenal or something contrary to international law, or if that nation is engaging in egregious human rights abuses to its own people, right, practicing genocide or something along those lines. And in those cases, coercive international intervention is generally considered to be justified, at least in principle. And so similarly, in the case of the family, the intervention of the political community, coercive intervention of the political community would only be justified if either what the family is doing is in some way a serious threat to the public order. You know, imagine if children were, or if the parents were training their children to be terrorists or something like that, right? Or on the other hand, if parents are engaging in abuse or neglect of their children, and though I think a very important emphasis there is that abuse and neglect has to be defined non-ideologically, because these days I think we see many instances where abuse or neglect are defined ideologically to include you know, even things like failing to expose children to diverse worldviews, right? It becomes considered to be abusive, right? Or a concerned parent of a 12-year-old girl saying, I don't want to give my child puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, even though she claims to be transgender, because, you know, I'm concerned that there are other social influences that are at the heart of this. And so let's be cautious before entering into a kind of line of treatment that is irreversible and harmful to health, and with scant evidence to show that it actually helps the children even deal with the gender dysphoria. In fact, it often seems to make it worse. So, you know, but these are situations where we've already seen, at least in my country, that, you know, you have people advocating for overriding parental decision-making in these sorts of cases. And that's obviously not genuine abuse or neglect, right? Those are situations where the parental decision ought to be respected. And the whole other thing is genuine abuse or neglect. And while there could be disputes about what counts as abuse or neglect, on the margins, I think by and large, reasonable people would agree that anything that's clearly and seriously physically damaging to the child's health, for instance, or failing to provide any education at all, right, would count as neglect. But things short of what reasonable people would understand to be abuse or neglect should not be considered in that category. And I think one rule of thumb would be to say, if a parenting practice is considered to be a good parenting practice, or is engaged in by a majority or even a very significant minority of parents, or has been engaged in, by entire cultures, right, for centuries, then it seems that it would be clearly an exaggeration to call that practice abusive or neglectful.
In the cases of abuse and neglect, legitimate abuse
Right.
and neglect, you even say that it's obvious that the parents' authority is not being exerted. The parents are not
Right.
exerting their rights because they are abusing, they are neglecting, they are not educating.
Right.
We have this discussion very hard here in Brazil, and I kept saying that it's abuse, it's not homeschooling. So
Exactly.
we have to treat the things logically
Exactly.
differently. But before we talk a little bit more about this, I have a curiosity, which curiosity of mine, which was not in the script. So, but I will apologize and ask. You talked right now, and you write about a lot about the family as a sphere of sovereignty, or a sphere of sovereignty, and this is very similar with an approach which you have here in Brazil, the approach of New Calvinism. Abraham Kuyper and Herman Dooyeweerd, which are Protestant thinkers. They are not of the Thomistic tradition, Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, but and I even make this comparison in the book because now Calvinism is getting traction here in Brazil nowadays. So I think it's very interesting that by different ways of approaching, by an Aristotelian Thomistic theory of natural law, and by the Neo-Calvinism, we can state the very same thing. That is, the family as a sphere of sovereignty. My curiosity is, did you have any influence or reference about those thinkers by getting to this insight, or it's really a coincidence here, because it's not referred in your research? So I think that it was really something that you came up by other ways of thinking.
Yeah. No, I'm not aware of their work, though I'd be very interested to hear more about it. I think, no, it just is a convergence of people coming to the same conclusion from two different lines of thought. And I think it does just reflect the fact that in a way, what's going on here is a defense of common sense, right? I mean, up until very recently, the idea that you had to defend the claim that parents should have the right and obligation to be able to raise their own children as they see fit, I mean, it just seemed obvious, right? And so I think, it's not until a view becomes widely challenged that then people are forced to actually articulate a defense of that view. And I think that's what's happening with parental rights in our current culture, is that for a variety of reasons, the cultural context that supported the common sense view, that parents are the primary educators of their children, that cultural context is breaking down in many ways. And as a result, now we need a more robust theoretical defense of what used to be considered just obvious to basically everybody.
Great. Here in Brazil, many people think that it's okay that parents have authority in moral and even spiritual matters, but not in academic matters, and therefore they should compulsorily send their children to school. You have already talked a little bit about that, but what do you have to say about that specifically? The relationship between moral and spiritual matters and intellectual matters, the human being as a whole being, anyway.
Right. Well, I mean, so I think the first point would simply be to reiterate that the authority of parents over the upbringing of children includes their upbringing as a whole, and that includes their intellectual development, not only their moral and spiritual development, though of course moral and spiritual development are very important. But I think it's almost impossible to separate these things entirely from one another, right? It's not that when you send a child to school, they're being formed only academically. I mean, the school has an environment, the school, even if it attempts to be neutral, certainly has implicit values, even in deciding what to teach and what not to teach, what to emphasize in teaching, what to de-emphasize in teaching. All of these things are extremely value-laden, right? So the idea that you could have a neutral education, even when you attempt to simply focus on academics, is nearly impossible. And in fact, you know, for example, for a seriously religious family who wants to help to raise their children in the faith, the fact that during the entire school day, which is the majority of the child's waking hours, there's no references to God, no religion, no, I mean, even in this country, you know, so there's been some extreme things of children being told they're not allowed to privately pray, you know, in school and things like that. And so, you know, that distorts the child's view, because children come to see as normal and good what they practice on a frequent basis. And if for most of their day, most of the week, they're in an environment where religion is clearly unwelcome, treated with a kind of hostility or just absent, right? That sends a distorting message that I think many religious parents in and of itself might find problematic. And then of course you have many instances where there are just blatantly ideological curricula in the school, or very controversial ways of presenting things like teaching about sexuality and so on, that many parents might reasonably object to, right? All of those things are happening. And so if you send your child to school, you have to take the whole package, right? And so so many parents might say that, you know, because even if they don't oppose the academic curricula in itself, because they have broader opposition to the moral environment of the school or to other things that are happening in the school, they may think that the only way to actually teach their children the moral and religious values that they want to teach them is to school them at home, or perhaps to send them to a private school, but not everybody has the means to do that.
Nice. I think that you already talked about a little bit about this previously, but let's talk about the more deep discussion, which is one of your chief concerns. You started talking about Dr. Stephen Macedo's work, that concern about mandatory autonomy education. Mm-hmm. Okay, the parents have the right to teach the children themselves, but what about the tolerance and the competing worldviews? How does that work?
Right. So, you know, many critics of parental rights will say that you know, parents should be required to send their children to public schools, or that all schools, including private schools, should have to include some kind of mandatory autonomy promoting curriculum that teaches children to be critical of the views that their parents are passing on at home and exposes them sympathetically to competing viewpoints. And I I mean, I think that a twofold answer can be given to that. Number one is that even if you think in principle that an education that explicitly attempts to expose children to different worldviews and helps them engage in a critique of the worldview parents are passing on, even if you think that that is an ideal education for children or for the future of democracy, nonetheless, the failure to provide that ideal education clearly is neither abusive nor neglectful. So there's no ground to coercively impose that one controversial educational vision on all children, right? And many people might disagree that that is, on balance, a beneficial way of educating children, particularly because when these things happen in an institutional setting, you're not going to be able to take into account the very significant differences that often occur in maturity levels of children of the same age and same grade level. It might be the case that for some 12-year-olds that they have sufficient maturity to start thinking through some, more difficult questions about competing worldviews and things like that, and that perhaps for some children of that age, an exercise like that could be beneficial. But for others, it might just be confusing and unsettling to them and prevent them from developing a kind of stable sense of identity, or might cause kind of rifts in the family community, because then children are being taught things at school that compete with what parents are trying to pass on at home. So these, I think, need to be very individualized educational decisions about what is best for a particular child. Now, I'm, somewhat sympathetic to the idea that at the right time and in the right way, part of education is exposing people to competing viewpoints and helping them to think through those and so on. But the right time may not, in some cases, be until college. And even then, it could be challenging for some students who lack the requisite level of maturity. If you do it too soon, you just cause confusion often, or it can just be a kind of excuse for children, perhaps of parents who have strict rules about what is allowed in the home, what kind of behaviors they're allowed to engage in, or what kind of movies they're allowed to watch, or video games they're allowed to play, and things like that. Then they get exposed to perhaps a more liberal worldview in school, and all of a sudden that worldview sounds great because it would seem to imply that they can do all of these things that their parents, for their own good, are preventing them from doing. That's obviously not a mature way,
desires,
right, of determining which worldview is better, but that's probably the more likely thing that's going to weigh in favor of one worldview over another for an immature 14-year-old. So I think people who think that this ought to be required for everybody are just failing to take into account the needed maturity for fruitfully engaging in dialogue with diverse worldviews. And I think they're also exaggerating the degree of insulation from diverse worldviews that children in private schools or children schooled at home experience, right? The fact that a child is schooled at home doesn't mean that they never encounter a different viewpoint in the broader culture. Certainly they will encounter different viewpoints in the broader culture. And even if by some crazy miracle or something, or set of circumstances, they manage to be raised in such a sheltered way that until they move out of their parents' home, at 18 or a little bit beyond, or that they don't encounter a different worldview, well, fine, but they'll encounter it eventually, right? And they have plenty of time to grapple with that in young adulthood. So it's not clear what the urgency is, right, to begin teaching children worldviews that compete with those of their parents at young ages, when they're most likely not really mature enough to benefit from that.
Nice. Well, finally, I'll make one final question here, which is a legal question, which can be addressed by this more deep philosophical view. We here in Brazil have a question about the homeschool in the legal perspective. No? So how do you see the situation here in Brazil, where we don't have any legislation about homeschooling, and because of that, the Supreme Court stated that there is no public subjective right to homeschooling. So they used this expression, public subjective right. According to your theory, we can say that homeschooling is a natural negative right, right? And I use that also to ground it in the or to ground homeschooling as a natural right, using as a human right, using the human protection system, the human rights protection system, international. So according to your theory, would it make it any sense to say that because of this, because of the Supreme Court saying that there's no public subjective right of homeschooling or to homeschooling here in Brazil, homeschooling could be considered forbidden in Brazil?
Well, that seems like a very funny line of reasoning, right? I am not an expert, obviously, on Brazil's legal code, but I presume that Brazil does not have laws explicitly giving people permission to go out and take a walk, or to go to the grocery store, or to look for a job, or to engage in the vast majority of activities that they engage in on a daily basis. But these are activities, in general, we presume that people have the right to go about their lives and fulfill their obligations and fulfill their natural duties. And unless there's explicit legislation to the contrary, we presume that the right exists, particularly when you're dealing with something that's such a fundamental natural right as being able to direct the education and upbringing of your child. So I think that, you know, the absence of legislation clearly is not any proof that the positive right to engage in homeschooling should be considered lacking legally.
And if we, well, here in Brazil, we have laws that say that parents should send their people to school. And that's the great argument for the decision of the Supreme Court. But let's say that even if we had, if we have a law that forbidden homeschool, as we have in Germany, for instance, it would be philosophically, of course, it would be right to say that the parents are forbidden to teach their own children.
Well, I mean, any such law, I think, is profoundly unjust. And I think it's instructive to note that the German law forbidding homeschooling originates to the Nazi era, right? That there is something inherently totalitarian about laws that prevent parents from educating their own children, right? And why would you have such laws? Well, I mean, the Nazis knew very well that the best way to brainwash people is to get them first when they're young, right? And then indoctrinate them in the Nazi ideology from a young age, turn them against their parents, and so on and so forth, right? This is just a standard tool of totalitarian regimes, and respect for the family, right, as its own kind of sphere of authority over its own affairs, including the education and upbringing of children. That is really a hallmark of limited government, right, and respect for individual rights and democratic principles. So now understood that there is a compulsory education law of some sort in Brazil, but it's not clear why parents ought to be required to fulfill that law by sending them to a government-run school. Can they not effectively have their own school at home, as long as they are educating their children? And you know, perhaps if there's concern, some relatively minimal regulations could be put in place that they need to, you know, inform the districts that they are planning to educate their children at home, and send, you know, these are the curricular materials that we are using, perhaps, an annual test or something to make sure that children are making progress. I mean, I'm not sure that such measures are even necessary, but if the state is concerned, then perhaps such measures could be used to ensure that children are in fact progressing academically as they ought to be. But the idea that the default, or even less the only way to fulfill the compulsory education law is to actually send your children to a physical school, much less a government-run school, seems backwards, given that the state's role in education is to help parents fulfill their task, right? Not the other way around. So if parents are willing and able to directly engage in the task of educating their children, many parents are not willing or able to do that. But those who are, well, why does the state even need to step in, right? The reason why the state provides its own schools and things like that is because they want to ensure that every child has access to an education. But if there are children who have access to an education independently of the state, well, then the public goal there has already been served. And often, I mean, at least based on statistics here in the US, generally the outcomes for children who are homeschooled or in private schools are much, much better on all levels, right? Academically, but also just in terms of maturity and character development of children and things like that. Even levels of civic engagement, democratic knowledge, and participation and so on tend to be much higher among homeschooling and private schooled children than among public school children, especially for minorities and some of the most disadvantaged groups. So it seems unclear why you should force parents into the option that is maybe not the best for their child, may not even be the best in general.
Okay, great. Let's remember St. Augustine, and lex in justa non est lex.
Exactly.
So I use that a lot in the book to argue in this sense. Well, right. Professor Melissa, I'm very grateful, really, really very grateful. That was so nice conversation, very elucidative also to every people here in Brazil. I don't have words to express my gratitude. And I would like to ask you to say final words for the Brazilian families, for the Brazilian homeschooler families, so we can end this so inspirative interview.
Well, thank you. It's really been my pleasure, and I just applaud the Brazilian homeschooling families for their bravery and doing what they believe is best for their children in unclear legal circumstances, and encourage them to continue to fight for legal recognition of their natural rights to educate their children as they think best.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will stop the recording right now. Pessoal, I'll talk in Portuguese for our audience. Pessoal, muito obrigado. Nós vamos continuar nessa semana de lançamento aqui. Vamos ter vídeos, lives com o professor Vitor Pinheiro, com a doutora Ângela Martins, que é uma amiga da professora Melissa, inclusive. I'll have an interview with Dr. Angela Gandra also in this week. I'm talking here to our audience, e com o Dr. Alexandre Magno também. Então, continuem conosco durante essa semana. Muito obrigado, um grande abraço a todos.